turn to Genesis 47, and I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 12, and we'll read the rest of it throughout this sermon this morning. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Then Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. This is the word of the Lord. This week, as I was looking at Genesis 47, I thought about an example in church history. The Wesley family, you may have heard of John and Charles Wesley. They've written a number of our hymns that we sing today. Their father Samuel and mother Susanna, they had 8 children at this time when they experienced a fire in their home. And they had their home catch on fire. And it got really bad that a lot of their kids were upstairs and they couldn't get downstairs and couldn't get out. So the neighbors, they obviously saw that the house was on fire, and they ran to the home, and they ended up getting on each other's shoulders to get these kids out of the window from the second story home. And by God's grace, all of them survived that day. And the moment that John Wesley, who was the youngest at the time, he was 6, the moment he was rescued, the father, Samuel, gathered the whole family together and the neighbors, and he said these words. He said, "Come, neighbors, let us kneel down. Let us give thanks to God. He has given me all my 8 children. Let the house go, and I am rich enough." What Samuel recognized is that God preserved and protected his kids from death. And he was thankful that God preserved and protected them from death. And even though he lost everything else, he was okay. He was content because he had his kids, and they were taken care of. It was John Wesley who later in his life wrote in his journal that he referred to himself as a brand plucked out of the fire. And he constantly went back and reminded that example of how God rescued him and his brothers and sisters in that fire that day. I thought of this example as we're looking at Genesis 47 because Jacob is the patriarch of his family. And he has just by faith taken all of his family from their homeland of Canaan, and they traveled a week-long journey with everyone that they had, their entire family we know of at least 70, a total family that came into Egypt, and they were going through a natural disaster of a famine. And God protected and preserved and provided for Jacob's family during this natural disaster. And they ended up making it and surviving through this very hard season of drought. This is where we are in Genesis 47. And we are in the middle of this drought season. And things were very hard for God's people. They were hard for the Egyptians. And now that Jacob and his family have settled into Egypt, or they're trying to settle, they have to go and get permission from the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. And they have to ask for his permission to settle in the land. And what we see in these first 12 verses is we see that God shows his kindness to his people when they faced the unknown. Just as he showed kindness to the Wesley family, and he showed kindness to us, so he showed kindness to Jacob and his family as they faced the unknown. They were going into uncharted waters, a foreign land that they knew nothing about, a pagan land. Like I said last week, it was like they were moving from Knoxville, Tennessee to Las Vegas. They were going into a very worldly society. And as they get there, Joseph, their brother, is prime minister, and he instructs the brothers on what to say when they see Pharaoh. And he said, keep your words very few, just be brief, and tell Pharaoh that you are shepherds. And we'll see what he says. The reason why Joseph did that was the Egyptians, they despised shepherds. They considered shepherds as an abomination. And normally, humanly speaking, if God were not in this, then what would normally happen is you have Israeli shepherds coming into Egypt, and Pharaoh would have immediately either had them killed or threw them in prison or just said, you're not welcome here. That's humanly speaking. But God is the author of this. He's in control of all things. And God wanted to preserve his people and protect his people. And so what did he do is he sent Joseph ahead of his people, and he raised Joseph up into being the prime minister. And now Joseph has this position of authority to speak truth to Pharaoh. And he's basically asking Pharaoh, can you let my family, who are considered detestable in your eyes, can you let them settle outside of the city in this area called Goshen and let them be free? So the brothers come in, and that's all they share. Well, they actually said a little bit more than they were supposed to say. But Pharaoh showed kindness. And after he met the brothers, and he said, sure, you can go and settle in Goshen outside of the city, and you can worship the Lord freely. And notice what else he said in verse 6. He said, the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen, and if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Right here we see God showing his kindness to his people as they're going in unknown places, where Pharaoh looks at them and he says to them, yes, you can settle there, even though you're shepherds and we really don't like shepherds, you can settle there. And by the way, if you're capable, then I'll put you in charge of my land, some of the land over there. You see the incredible amount of God's kindness shown to his people? They didn't deserve this. They weren't really expecting this, but God had other plans in mind because he was in control, and he wanted to make sure to protect his small group of remnant people, saying, I have a purpose for you, and I will make sure and preserve you from this natural disaster and from the hand of Pharaoh. This was a great act of mercy on Pharaoh's part. But then I want you to notice verses 7 through 12. Jacob, the patriarch of the family, 130 years old. The brothers just saw Pharaoh, and they received good graces from Pharaoh. Now, what will happen with the father? 130-year-old man, he walks in the room with the mightiest leader of the world's time. And what I love about this is he's not impressed. He's unimpressed by Pharaoh. He's not intimidated. In fact, he really doesn't care. He's 130 years old. He's got nothing to lose. And he walks in, and usually in Egyptian culture, anytime somebody would approach Pharaoh, they would be very respectful, and Pharaoh would bless them first. Pharaoh would have the first word. But not in this case. Jacob said the first words. He blessed Pharaoh before Pharaoh got to bless him. Isn't that interesting? And what that tells me is, in the eyes of God, Jacob was more important than Pharaoh was. In the eyes of the world, people are looking at Pharaoh like, oh, this guy's so powerful, he's wealthy, he's in control of all things. But in God's eyes, he's saying, no, Jacob is mine. I like what Matthew Henry said about Jacob here. He said, though in worldly wealth, Pharaoh was the greater, yet in interest with God, Jacob was the greater. He was God's anointed. Jacob was greater because he represented God's people. He was also the elder of the two. And he comes in and he blesses Jacob, or blesses Pharaoh instead of Pharaoh blessing Jacob. Now, you know what I thought about? I thought about as people age, they tend to not care as much. You know what I mean by that? They tend to just kind of say what's on their mind. And a lot of times that's freeing and it's kind of refreshing. It's like, man, I'm glad somebody spoke up and said something. But I will say, for those of you who are older and not afraid to just say it like it is, try to be respectful, be kind, but it is refreshing. It's refreshing when you get to a point in your life and you're like, man, I don't really care anymore what people think. I don't really care. I'm not really intimidated by these people. Like, really? Jacob was at that point in his life. He's 130 years old. He's in some ways a grumpy old man. He's like, I don't care anymore. I got nothing to lose with this Pharaoh. Yeah, sure, he might be the most powerful man in the world, but I don't care. I'm getting close to death. I don't give a rip. You know, as I think about this, I thought about my mother a couple years ago. She's been able to meet some celebrities over the years, and one of those celebrities was Reba McEntire, and I'll never forget it. I was over at some gathering, and I look over, and my mom's at the table with Reba McEntire, and they're just chatting up a storm for like 15 minutes. I said, Mom, what in the world were you talking about with Reba McEntire? She's like, well, we were just talking about life and her kids and, you know, some of the struggles she was having, just how life was going. I was like, really? And she's like, yeah, she's just a normal person. I was like, well, that's kind of cool. And then there was one incident where she met Martina McBride, and when she saw Martina, she said, hey, Martina, you've lost a lot of weight since I left. You're looking great. I was like, really, Mom? And she's like, yeah, I'm just trying to treat her like a normal human being. A couple years ago, this is before Governor Lee became governor, I was asked to go and pray for him, and it was a privilege. And I got to pray over the governor, and of course, I'm kind of starstruck, a little nervous, and a couple of you were at this gathering, and Donna was at this gathering, one of our members, and I'll never forget, she's over there with Marsha Blackburn, and they're talking for like 20 minutes. They're just laughing and joking and cutting up, and I went up to Donna and said, Donna, what in the world happened there? And she said, oh yeah, we were just talking, you know, just having fun. I was like, that's cool. I bring that up because people are people, and we don't really need to be intimidated by that, you know? Jacob wasn't intimidated. He believed in a God who is so much more powerful than Pharaoh. And he's at a point in his life where he just doesn't really care. And so he blesses Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's probably kind of stunned a little bit. But then after a while, I think Pharaoh, he kind of lightened up, and you notice he asked Jacob the question, you know, how old are you? And the reason he asked that question is Egyptian literature, it would state that the average Egyptian would make it to about 110. When Jacob entered the room, Pharaoh was like, this guy's older than 110. And he said, what's your secret? Like, how old are you? And then Jacob said, he said, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. You know what's interesting here is Jacob's response to Pharaoh. He's saying, I'm 130, and few and evil have been the days of my sojourning. Few, meaning life has been very short, very fast. But then he mentions the word evil. What I like here is Jacob just kind of threw it out there to Pharaoh. He's saying, this is life. This is the reality of life. Life is hard. And I've been through it, my man. I've been through it. 130 years. You know, I had a father who favored my older brother. I tried to trick my older brother. I was known as a deceiver. And then my older brother wanted me dead. I ran away from him for most of my life. And then I ended up marrying this woman. And I ended up marrying her sister because I was tricked by their relative, and then I ended up having to work 14 years to get the woman that I loved, and then the woman that I loved ended up kind of being bitter for a while because she couldn't have children, and she convinced me to be with other women and to have more children, and now I have all these kids, and I've made all these mistakes, and he's like, then my wife has died, and my daughter was raped, and my sons have been rebellious, and I just left the land of promise, and now I'm in this foreign land, and life has been evil. It's been hard. And what I love about it is he's just a real man, a real guy, and he's saying, this is reality. My life has been short, and it's been frankly hard, Pharaoh. And then he goes on to say, and I've been a sojourner. A sojourner. That is really a key word in this chapter, sojourner. Because what he was getting at was, I'm a kind of a resident alien. Like, I'm just here for a little while, and then I've moved from place to place, and I'm waiting for my eternal residence and home. Like, I've just been an alien resident going from place to place, and now I'm here, and this is where God has me. And then right after this, he ends up blessing Pharaoh again, and what does Pharaoh do? But he gives Jacob and his family the best of the land. The best of the land. What impressed me here is that Jacob was giving Pharaoh some wisdom, some insight on the reality of life, how it can be hard. And there's ups and downs in life. There's ebbs and flows in life. It can be hard, but it can be good. And I think what he's getting at here is that Pharaoh, you're going to experience the same thing as you get older. For those of you who are older in this room, you've got a lot of wisdom, a lot of years that you can provide insight to us who are younger, right? You could tell us, hey, this is the lesson I learned. This is where I failed. You may not want to do this way. You may not want to make that kind of decision because, believe me, I went down that road and it didn't get me anywhere. Or this is the road I went down and God blessed me for it. There's a lot of wisdom in this room. And I encourage you, don't overshare, but I encourage you to mentor younger people and to invest in them and give them wisdom. Because that's what we see just in this brief moment Jacob doing to Pharaoh. But ultimately, God was showing his kindness to his people as they were facing an unknown situation. They didn't know how Pharaoh would respond, and Pharaoh responded graciously, and he gave them the land. So it's a powerful, powerful example of God showing kindness. The second thing we see here is the second section, verses 13 through 27. It's a lengthy one. But God shows kindness to his people when he gives us godly leaders, not just when we face unknown situations, but also when he gives us godly leaders. So let's look now at verses 13 through 27. There was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be your servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priest he did not buy, for the priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord. We will be servants to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priest alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. When people read this section, there have been liberal scholars who read it, and they say Joseph treated these people horribly. They would say that Joseph took advantage of being over the people, and he robbed from these people. And people would say that he was a ruthless tyrant. But I would argue that he wasn't a ruthless tyrant here, but he acted in a humanitarian way. He was responsible for all of Egypt's resources. He was put second in command as prime minister, and it was during years of famine, 7 years of a natural disaster. Joseph was able to store away a lot of grain to prepare for these 7 years of disaster. Joseph had a limited supply. He couldn't just give it to everybody freely. He had to be very wise in how he dispersed this extra food because it had to last for a couple more years. And so notice here that Joseph did not put people on welfare. He did not give them a handout. But instead, these people were still able to work. They were able to give things so that they could receive food. So Joseph acted in a humanitarian way, but also in a responsible way as he was managing Egypt's resources. So the first thing they did was they gave money to buy food. Well, they ran out of money. And then Joseph instituted what we would call a bartering system. A bartering system where there was a free transaction that was still taking place. The people didn't have to enter this transaction with Joseph. But ultimately they did because they were hungry and they had no food left over. And so after they ran out of money, what did they do? Well, they still had livestock. So they gave away their livestock to Egypt. And then after giving up all their livestock, they were still hungry because there was years of famine. So what did they do? Well, Joseph then enacted, again, this bartering system where he would say, we will take your land from you, but here's the deal. 80% of it you can still work on. It can still be yours in the sense of you can still till the ground. You can hold it, you're responsible for that property, and 20% then goes to Pharaoh. What's great about this is, I didn't know this till this week, but whenever you study ancient Near East history, it's like a tax code, what was going on here. And most ruthless empires, they would take a lot more of the land from the people. It'd be way more than 20%. And if you think about Western nations today and the tax code and how as people make more money, they end up getting taxed more and more and more, which is really robbing from the rich. It's the Robin Hood principle. That's not good here. That's what's going on here. But yet Joseph, he was very fair. Where normally it'd probably be 30 to 40% taxed, Joseph's saying, I'm taxing 20%. So it just shows a lot of mercy from Joseph. It shows a lot of grace that he's saying, I don't want to take advantage of you, but you still are able to give. And so because you're able to give and you're able to work, then I'm going to ask that for you. I'm not just going to give you a handout and put you on welfare. Like, I want to help you. And so this is the way I'm helping you and helping everybody, where everybody wins. And so that's what happened, where the people still had responsibility. They still had their household integrity. So Joseph treated them well. One author said that he preserved the lives of his people, the dignity of his people, and the production of the land for future generations. What was happening here is that God put a godly leader in this very difficult time, and there were non-believers who were benefiting from this godly leader. If you study history, there have been godly leaders throughout history, and when there are godly leaders who really care for people and they care for what's best, everybody benefits. The Egyptians were benefiting from Joseph's godly leadership. They were benefiting because they were able to survive. They were able to maintain and keep going during this natural disaster. And that's what we call common grace, God's common grace, where he provides good things to happen even to non-believers. But in verse 27, we see that God's sole purpose was to provide care for his people. And we see that Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. God's people were blessed because God had a godly leader amongst them who was a good administrator, a good manager, a good steward, and he cared for what was best for the land and for the people. He had their best interest at heart. And as a result, God blessed his people. They were fruitful and multiplied. And this gives us a picture of what it will look like in the days of Egypt when you get to Exodus. Because you'll begin to see when God sent plagues on his people, or on the people who were hurt by the plagues, the Egyptians who were blessed by the plagues, his people, in the sense that they weren't harmed by it. Here's a little bit of that picture and a little foreshadowing of God providing for his people, even when the world was not being provided for. This is not always the case where Christians prosper in a world around them while the world struggles. At least it's not always the case materially or worldly. There are times when Christians will be in a world environment and things are very hard, they're persecuted. And we pray for the persecuted all the time. But what I would argue is that as believers, we've been given so much from the Lord. We've received so many blessings from him, spiritual blessings. We've received an eternal inheritance that non-believers haven't received. And so we need to be reminded of the blessings God has given us eternally and not just here temporally. But every now and then he does provide for his people temporally. You know, one thing I do pray for often is that God would give us leaders that we need and not that we deserve. Because as we mentioned earlier in Romans chapter 3, no one is good, no, not one. So what do we deserve? We deserve leaders who take advantage of us. But yet God, who is rich in love and mercy, oftentimes will give us leaders that we need and not that we deserve. And so is God pressing on your heart to lead or to be a future leader? And leadership comes in many forms and fashions, many shapes and sizes. But we need godly leaders in education. We need godly leaders in business. We need godly leaders in law. We need godly leaders in engineering. We need godly leaders in politics. We need godly leaders in the home. We need godly leaders serving on HOAs and in our neighborhoods. We need godly leaders in the church. God shows kindness to his people when he gives us godly leaders. And he gave his people in this time in history a godly leader who really had their best interest at heart. The third thing I would say here is that God shows kindness to his people when we reach the end. Verse 28. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. What we see here is that God showed kindness to Jacob, and he shows kindness to his people as we reach the end of our lives. Jacob was 130 years old. He had 17 more years to give. He didn't know that at the time, but we know it later because he died at 147. But what I love about this is the number 17. If you remember at the very beginning of this series, how old was Joseph when he was sold by his brothers to go to Egypt? 17. Jacob had 17 years with his baby boy who became a toddler, then a young boy, and then a teenage, almost young adult. Then he loses Joseph for most of Joseph's life. Now he reunites with his son again, and he has 17 more years with Joseph. But this time, Joseph is a young adult man. God blessed Jacob, and you see a bookend of this relationship. 17 years in the beginning and 17 years at the end. It gives us a picture of God's divine providence and sovereignty in this life and in this story. But what I love about it is Jacob was blessed to see Joseph in this way. And as a pastor, I have the privilege of being with you when you celebrate. I also have the privilege of being with you when you cry. Your highs and lows in life. And the highs are always fun because I go to weddings and I go to graduations and I go to anniversaries and birthday parties and retirement services. And what I love is to see families together. And the thing I love the most is to see the look on an older person's face when they look at their older children and their grandchildren. And it's like they're swelling with pride. It's like they're saying, oh, I've lived a lot of life. And God has blessed me richly with my adult children and now my grandchildren. And I'm excited to leave a lasting legacy with my grandchildren. Now, as my kids are getting older, I'm starting to see a little bit of that. I'm not a grandparent yet, and I hope not to be for a while. But it's been fun to see my kids growing up. And just this week, we were watching videos of when they were infants and toddlers, and my kids have just loved it. And they're saying, oh, I can't believe I used to say those words, or I can't believe I used to act that way. And they're also saying how mom and dad, we cared for them when they were toddlers and babies. And it made us kind of miss the baby phase, but it also made us to reminisce. And what we loved about it is that it just brought smiles on everybody's faces. And it gave me and Stephanie a sense of pride because it's like, yeah, God has provided for us. Now that Abby's 13 and when she was 1, or now that Katie's 11 and she was 2, and Caleb 10 and he was 3, and all these videos we're seeing, and Sarah 8 and she was 4, and it's just amazing to see their development. I think this is Jacob here. He's reached the end of his life and he's watching his son, but not just Joseph. He's seeing Judah change. He's seeing his other boys change, and he's saying, there's a sense of satisfaction here. God has shown his mercy to me as I'm aging. And the other thing that I think Jacob was satisfied about was he's asking Joseph to promise him to bury him next to his ancestors. He's saying, I don't want to be buried in Egypt when I die. Please promise that I'll be buried in the land of promise, because what it represents. It represents good days to come for my grandchildren and my future generations, because God has promised that one day things will get better for his people, that one day they'll be in the promised land. Even though I won't go back to this promised land and I won't receive those kind of blessings, by golly, I hope my grandkids or my great-great-great-great-grandkids will receive it. As I think about that, I thought about you and me and how that should be our aim. We need to leave this place better than where it is now. We need to make it our aim to please the Lord, and also we need to try to make every effort to make it better for our grandkids and our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, so that when they are here, they'll receive more of God's blessings than less. God showed his kindness to Jacob because he put this eternal mindset on his heart and in his mind, and he told Jacob, Jacob, one day, I promise, you'll be a father of many nations along with your grandfather Abraham, and your people will be back in a land, and then one day you'll be in an eternal land of heaven. What a blessing and what kindness God's showing to his person Jacob as he reached the end of his life. You know, as I want to wrap this up and we go into communion, I want you to think about the big picture here. I want you to think about the life of Joseph. Joseph went before his family, and just as Joseph went to Egypt before his family and prepared room for his family to be rescued, so Jesus is in heaven. And John 14 tells us he's preparing a place for us. And just as Joseph was able to provide food for his brothers when they were in need, so Jesus, he provides us spiritual food when we are in need. There are so many connections with the life of Joseph and Jacob to Christ.